Welcome to the New Mormon Truth, video number 19, U.S. Church History, Part 4, U.S. History from 1754 to 1831. So this is just a summary of U.S. history during this time frame, and the reason is to provide a context for the Restoration. In a previous video, I went over basically the prelude to the Restoration, which is pretty much a religious history. This is going to cover United States history, because nothing happens in a vacuum. And the various sources used for creating these videos or from the church have real no information about U.S. history or the context. So Saints Volume 1 has no information. The Teacher's Manual has no information. The Comprehensive History of the Church has no information. And the Church History in the Fullness of Times, which looks like this on the front, this cover, has a little bit on the Constitution in Chapter 1. So I want to provide some historical background to the Restoration. That's the whole point of this video. And I assert any use of copyrighted material in this video is fair use. So here's just what we're going to cover. We're going to cover the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Second Great Awakening. Actually, that will be a separate video. The construction of the Erie Canal, and sort of the rise of anti-Freemasonry. Oh, well, let's get right into it, the French and Indian War. So, this occurred between 1754 and 1763. What you have is England, France, and Spain all wanted land because they needed resources. So here's, England was over here, and the French were over here, and then the next is the French. The English were expanding westward, so they were coming from the colonies this way. The French were up here; they were coming south. They wanted access to the Mississippi because they had a port down here, and they wanted to get their goods or their resources out. So this led to a war. So if you really think about it, the United States becomes the United States, and we get rid of the English, the French, and the Spanish. Well, the French and Indian War is actually where we get rid of the French. So, next point. And the Native American tribes, which were all living in here, some of them side with the English, some of them side with the French, and we go to war. In the Iroquois Confederacy, which is in the New York area, right around in here, I'm circling, they side with England. The reason I point this out is, the Smiths, well, they're living like in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, so over here. So if you don't know, the French and Indian War is going to take place, sort of the battles are going to take place right around in here. So the French were winning until 1757 when England started pumping in a bunch of money. The war ends in 1763. And maybe just to say, one of the important reasons for this is not only the development of the United States and it's what happens afterwards, but Solomon Mack, who is Joseph Smith's grandfather on Lucy Mack, fought in the French and Indian War. So Joseph Smith would have heard stories about the French and Indian War from his grandfather. So, so back to the points. So the war ended in 1763. England got Canada and all the land east of the Mississippi, so this area. So the French were out. French got rid of it, and England now had claimed all this, and here were the colonies. And of course, this time the colonies were under British control. So effectively, England had all this land over here. And this opened it up for settlement, so now people could actually move to this. This area over here was actually called the Northwest Territory at the time, because this is sort of as far as it went if you think this is the North and the West. At the time it was the Northwest. Not what we think is the Northwest today, but this was the Northwest then. So it opened this area, opened it up for settlement. And to pay for the war, the colonies got heavily taxed. And guess what? This is where we're at to the American Revolution. So the American Revolution, Just a note that Joseph Smith Sr. is actually born in 1771. Lucy is born in 1776. They will actually be small children or young kids during the American Revolution. So the first Continental Congress, basically the colonies get together in the first Continental Congress and they decide to boycott British trade and the petition King George III. Doesn't really work. So now the Second Continental Congress, these are actually a series of meetings over these years. Not that they met once, but this is it's the colonies meeting together. And then the famous 1776, this is where the colonies, issue the Declaration of Independence, which states basically the 13 colonies are now independent states. So each one is a separate independent state. So this is almost like the pre-Constitution. If you wonder what held the colonies together before the Constitution, it was actually called the Articles of Confederation. These two dates here, I believe this is when it was submitted for signing or ratification. This one was actually ratified. So basically, it still said the states were sovereign, so each state was an independent state. The group or the Articles of Confederation had no power to tax or to regulate commerce between states, but it had the ability to make alliances, print money, and form the most important thing, Continental Army, which is going to be used in the American Revolution. So this is now the American Revolution. My point is there's many battles that took place near. So, near is relative. The Smiths families in Massachusetts. The Smiths family were basically like in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. So, a few battles took place there. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Some battles in Vermont and New Hampshire. So this would have been, remember, Joseph Smith Sr. is born in 1771, so he's seen these battles as a young kid, or hearing about them. In 1783, this is when the war ends. The 13 states get the land east of the Mississippi River, but the British retain Canada. So this is when we get that land from the colonies all the way over to the Mississippi River, and Britain still retains Canada. So the Constitution actually just wasn't a simple thing. If you don't know, the issue with the Constitution was it was a weak central government, and the Articles of Confederation caused what I'm going to call coordination problems. Meaning, since it was weak, they had to all still come together to hammer out problems. So I had coordination problems with the Continental Army, because how do you, what men are going to go there, how are you going to regulate commerce, trade between the states, and how are you going to raise money? It created these problems. So the solution that was issued was a stronger central government. But the problem with that was the common political view was that a strong central government, like what was proposed in the Constitution, would eventually lead to abuse of power. The 13 states had just thrown off Britain tyranny. I know tyranny may be a strong word, but British rule. So the common political view is they were not interested in a strong government. So this is sort of a battle. This is, what was the year? It was like 1780. So you actually have, Joseph Smith Sr. being a young man, and Lucy a little bit younger. So they're seeing these, this is the politics of the day. You had the Anti-Federalists who were supported by many. This is sort of like the ordinary Americans, especially farmers. They objected to the Constitution as lack of protection of individual liberties. And you had the Federalists who supported the Constitution. What they had going for them is they were well organized, had newspaper support, and support of the celebrities of the day, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Well, at the end of the day, the Constitution and Bill of Rights, one, provided a stronger central government to sort of the chagrin of the Anti-Federalists, which were most ordinary Americans, provided taxation powers and regulated commerce. So, like in 1891, this is, Joseph Smith Sr. is like 20 years old when this is happening, right? right in this time frame. So he's not a young man anymore. He's sort of a, or maybe he's a young man if you want to call him that. So this is real stuff, you know. So that means Joseph Smith's father would have been influenced by all this, and his mother too. So conflicts with Native Americans. So remember, you know, all that land we had in the first slide. You had the, you know, the French, the British, and the Native Americans. Well, we just got rid of the French. We got rid of the British, and now, you know, the Americans are going to try to get rid of the Native Americans. So the conflicts with Native Americans force the Native Americans to Canada, Florida, and west of the Mississippi. So after the American Revolution, basically the tribes that sided with the British, the American colonies considered that they had lost their lands. They had lost. They were involved in the war. They sided with the British. They lost their land. Of course, the Native Americans didn't see it that way. So this led to conflicts like what was called the Northwest Indian War. Remember, Northwest is relative at that time. This is the area of like Ohio, Wisconsin, right up in there. So there it is. Geez, I should have just read right there. So conflicts over there. And this is where I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in the slide presentation, just because I want to cover all the Native American conflicts. But a war or some battles in the area of Indiana with Tecumseh. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. There's actually these battles are actually more considered part of the War of 1812, but these take place with the Native Americans in the Indiana Territory. Basically, the Native Americans wanted to form their own state. So this is going on right during this time, 1811 to 1813. Like I said, I'm jumping ahead of myself just to cover everything, but then this is 1816. This is actually after the War of 1812, which I'm getting to next. Then America is fighting the Native Americans down in Florida, which is called the First Seminole War. And then in 1830, I know I'm almost skipping to the end, but the United States issues the Indian Removal Act, which forced the relocation of the Native Americans west of the Mississippi. So if you've heard of the Trail of Tears, this is where this comes from during this time, during the 1830s. It also caused the Second Seminole War down in Florida. By 1840, many Native American tribes have been relocated west of the Mississippi. So basically, you have the United States, you know, after or starting with the American Revolution, fighting the Native Americans and moving them west of the Mississippi during this time frame. So Louisiana Purchase, maybe this is a good summary. I know I'm going to get to this, but you had the original colonies. Remember, this is the area that was acquired after the American Revolution. And then I talked about the wars with the Native Americans in the Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana area. So this is the Northwest area. So now on to the Louisiana Purchase. This is the area of the Louisiana Purchase right here in green. So if you want to look at this map, this is actually how, when, and how, from whom the United States acquired its land. So we have the colonies, we have wars right here, and we buy a bunch of chunk of land right here, the Louisiana Purchase. I should note, I haven't noticed this, but all these square brackets, these are my sources. They'll be at the end of the video if you want to go check them out. I should say I'm not an expert in history. This is just from what I've read and can remember from U.S. history. So in 1803, the United States purchases 800,000 square miles of land for $15 million. How should I convert that into $2020? So it basically doubled the size of the United States. And Joseph Smith was born in 1805, but you know his parents were now married, obviously married by then. So this money was used, the $15 million, and Napoleon used the funds to fund his wars between 1803 and 1815 with different coalitions of European countries between those dates. These coalitions of countries were usually led by the United Kingdom. So basically you have a bunch of warfare taking place during this time over in Europe. So now with the War of 1812, this is actually the burning of the White House in 1814. I forget who the artist is here. I wish I should have mentioned or noted it. But I really do like this this picture. So War of 1812. Basically, Britain was fighting Napoleon, and they block U.S. supplies. They're going to come over and send ships, form a blockade. They're going to block U.S. supplies to France, and they impress U.S. seamen. Impress means basically you see United States ship, you commandeer it, and you tell the men, you take them and you say you're part of the U.S. Navy, forced. So that's what impressment means. So basically, they're blockading, preventing trade, and then the British are taking U.S. seamen and making them British Navy. Of course, the United States doesn't like this. So it declares war in 1812, and the United States attacks Canada, which was a British colony. Then the British forces in the Indian Confederacy with Tecumseh push U.S. forces out of Canada and capture Detroit. So now the British are in the United States. But the U.S. then defeats the British in the Battle of Lake Erie, take back Detroit, and they defeat the Indian Confederacy. Tecumseh is killed. And then in April 1814, the British defeat Napoleon, and they take those troops and shift them to the United States. And this is probably the big thing. August 1814, the British capture and burn Washington, D.C. Government buildings. And maybe I should just back up and go, why is this important? Well, you know, Joseph Smith in, I believe, 1812 has his leg surgery, and they're living in near Dartmouth College. And then he goes to recover with his uncle in Salem, and I believe 1813, or that's about the years, if you read history. So, you know, this would be Joseph Smith as you know, like a 7-year-old, 7, 8, 9-year-old. So he probably would have heard about this. No doubt his leg surgery would have probably been foremost on his mind. But then when he goes to recover, you know, it's, you know, Salem. You have to then remember that's smack dab in the middle of the War of 1812. If he's in Salem, Massachusetts in 1813, he could have probably looked out and saw a British blockade of ships. And then he definitely would have heard about the burning, and, you know, here you didn't have British troops invading, you know, the United States and burning the White House. So this is going on when he's a young boy. So I've sort of just covered that. So the British firmly block New England coast, severely crippling the economy. So maybe just to tack on that blockade I just talked about, Salem and up and down New England, was severely crippling the economy, which is where the Smiths were living. So this is impacting the Smiths. So, but then the U.S. naval forces defeat the British in New York. Then the British bombard Fort McHenry for 25 hours. Nothing happens, so they decide to go off to New Orleans. And this is where Francis Scott Key writes Star Spangled Banner. Then December 1814, I think basically the British know they're not getting anywhere, and they decide just to call it quits. And basically, Canada remains the same, but the British are going to end support to Native Americans in the support of their independent state in the Northwest. So if you go back to those previous slides where the America was fighting the Native Americans in the Northwest, that was being backed by the British. So the British basically, some people consider the War of 1812 Part 2 of the American Revolution. We finally get rid of the British once and for all, and also the British in the support of the Native Americans. And then, but unfortunately, the word doesn't get to, you know, this is being signed in Ghent over in Europe, and the news doesn't reach, you know, the United States and the British forces. And Andrew Jackson defeats a major British attack in the Battle of New Orleans. So after the treaty signed, there's still a major battle, but Andrew Jackson wins this famous battle. So continuing on. So this is 1815. Now 1816. This is actually where the Saints. I actually have that Saints Volume 1. This is actually where Saints starts. So all that previous stuff is not even in Saints. But this is all, that's all, you can, if you've been listening, you can, or my point is that all these various wars, French and Indian War, American Revolution, War of 1812 are influencing the Smiths, and it's not even mentioned in the Saints. It starts with the year without the summer in 1816, which is the eruption of Mount Tambora. This leads to the year without a summer in 1816. And this causes a major crop failure, food shortages, and famine. The Smiths moved to Palmyra in January 1817. So, and now the Second Great Awakening. So, really, I've been talking about mostly just what I call history, political history up until then. But the Second Great Awakening, what was taking place sort of like during the cultural or the spiritual side of society. So, and then some of this history of the religious history was covered in the Prelude to the Restoration, but I'm just going to mention this in passing because I'm going to have a whole separate video on it, on the Second Great Awakening. Basically, this is, I believe, from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says a Protestant religious revival, or the Second Great Awakening, is a Protestant religious revival in the United States from about 1795 to 1835. The dates change if you look in different sources. Many churches experienced a great increase in membership, particularly among Methodists and Baptists. If you remember, Joseph Smith history says he was actually sort of drawn to the Methodists. And the Second Great Awakening made soul winning the primary function of ministry. So, and if you actually read the Encyclopedia Britannica article down a little bit below, it actually says in the area of New England that the 1820s was sort of like the prime time of the Second Great Awakening, or the revivals then came, or were most, I'm going to call it a fever pitch. It's probably not a good term, but most active in the 1820s, and that's exactly when you have the first vision. Spring 1820, you have the first vision. And then I did mention I'm going to cover this in more detail in the next video. So another thing that's, so I've sort of covered political history, maybe cultural with the Second Great Awakening, and this is sort of economic. Remember, the Smiths were poor farmers, but a big boost to the economy came in in 1825 with the construction of the Erie Canal. So this blue line is the Erie Canal. So it sort of comes over here from Lake Erie near Buffalo, runs along here. This red dot is Palmyra, approximately, and then it continues to the Hudson River, just north of Albany. So this was a big economic boom. So the construction of the Erie Canal is from 1817 to 1825. It linked Lake Erie to the Hudson River. It was 363 miles, and it was 40 feet wide by 4 feet deep. I believe it was widened later, and it had to change, since you have to change elevations of the water, it consisted of 83 locks. So actually you can see a lock back here where the ship would go into, or the boat would come in here, and they'd, raise it, adjust the water level so it could sail, or not sail, but move out. It cost at the time $7.1 million, which in, I know I'm recording this January 1st, 2020, but in 2019 dollars, $185 million, and that was repaid by tolls. so you had to pay to use the Erie Canal. But to show the big economic boom that this created, before the Erie Canal, wagon travel took about 15 to 45 days. This is going from Buffalo to Albany. It took 15 to 45 days, and to transport cargo took about $125 a ton. It's a lot of money then. After the canal was built, travel time was about 9 days, and cargo it's $6 a ton. Wow, that's like, even if you get even on the low side of travel, it's about half the time. And cargo, man, that's like, what is that, 5% of this? So greatly reduced. So my point is, Palmyra was no longer a frontier town, but a town along a new and major transportation route. So the Smiths lived in Manchester at this time, which is about 2 miles from Palmyra. So the next this is more of a political, also cultural thing. The murder of William Morgan. These are just some Freemasonry stuff, because William Morgan was a Freemason. So William Morgan, a Freemason, disappeared in September 1826. Basically, he was going to publish an expose of Freemasonry. I believe the Royal Arch degrees. If you don't know anything about Masonry, those are certain rituals. Different exposés had been published before this, but he was going to publish his own, which I think the Royal Arch rituals were not published before then. But basically, he was going to do something the Freemasons didn't like, and it was rumored that the Freemasons took him, kidnapped him, and killed him. Didn't make people happy, because then basically there was a cover-up, and people said, oh, the Freemasons were involved in the cover-up. This is what happened. So this is a quote, I forget from where. You can look at the source. The circumstances of Morgan's disappearance and the minimal punishment received by his Freemasonry kidnappers caused public outrage. Protests against Freemasons took place in New York and the neighboring states. All Freemasons were under a cloud of suspicion. I should note that this disappearance of William Morgan took literally in the place in the backyard where the Smiths lived. So this is right in his backyard. It's almost like your city. Whatever the city you're living in now, that's right where it happened. It was the epicenter of the big William Morgan murder, disappearance, anti-Freemasonry. Joseph Smith and his family were right smack dab in the middle of this social, political upheaval. And another quote, because judges, businessmen, bankers, and politicians were often Freemasons, ordinary citizens began to think that it was an elitist group. Moreover, many claimed that the lodges, this is where Freemasons meet, the Freemasons' secret oaths bound Masons to favor each other against outsiders in courts and elsewhere. So this is what was accused in the William Morgan's murder, is that like the jury or the judge were Freemasons, and basically his Freemasonry kidnappers were let go because they were Freemasons, so they didn't have to get punishment because of these secret oaths. So then there's this whole backlash against Freemasonry, secret organizations, and things like that. So then you had basically this caused a big decline in Freemasonry. And just remember, George Washington was a Freemason. So that was earlier. I think George Washington died in 1801. So many left Freemasonry, and many lodges closed during this time frame. This led politically to the Anti-Masonic Party from 1828, and I think by the mid 1830s it was in decline, and by 1840 it was gone. This also led to the expose. So basically, people who left Freemasonry started exposing all their rituals, and the big, almost the anti-Masonic Bible called Light on Masonry was published in 1829 by David Bernard. It had over 40 Freemasonry degrees or rituals. So you can know a lot about Freemasonry was exposed, from 1828 going forward. And notable Mormons who are or were Freemasons was Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother. John Smith, this is Joseph Smith's uncle. Oliver Cowdery was a Freemason. Heber C. Kimball was a Freemason. Martin Harris was a Freemason. And W. Phelps was a Freemason. These two were actually also known to be, they actually left Freemasonry and became what were called anti-Freemasons. So they then lobbied against Freemasonry. And Joseph Smith, if you didn't know, actually became a Freemason in 1842. I'll probably have a whole separate video on Freemasonry. But just, this was a big to-do then. This is a big, this whole anti-secret society and these oaths that they took was a big deal in 1826, especially from 1828. Basically, I'll skip it for the video on Freemasonry. So just a review of the timeline: 1874 to 1763. Did I say those dates right? French and Indian War. Then you have Joseph Smith was born, and Lucy was born in 1776. You had the American Revolution. Then you had the U.S. Constitution. So just going back, remember, look at the ages. You can see how old they were. So, Joseph Smith's parents were alive during the American Revolution, young, even though they were young. They would have been sort of teenagers during the Constitution. Remember that Solomon Mack fought in the French and Indian War. He also fought in the American Revolution. And Joseph Smith's senior's father served, I think, briefly there in the American Revolution. And you have the Louisiana Purchase, so big expansion in the United States. Joseph Smith was born in the War of 1812. Joseph Smith would have, as a boy, would have personally experienced, or would have affected him. He would have seen it directly. Year Without a Summer. Obviously, Smith's leg surgery, and then they have to move because of Year Without a Summer. You also have the Second Great Awakening going on during this time, so the social context of the Restoration. And then you have the First Vision. So the First Vision and the Angel Moroni is taking place within the context of the Second Great Awakening. And then you have the economic side of the economic context. Erie Canal being finished. Palmyra is not a frontier town. You now have also political and social upheaval with the murder of William Morgan. Then Joseph Smith gets the gold plates and publishes the Book of Mormon, 1827-1830. Then you have, during all this time, you have the Indian Removal Act. And then the Smiths moved to Ohio and Missouri in 1831. So this is almost the U.S. history during this time frame. So basically it covers church history up from the beginning up to when the Saints moved to Ohio and Missouri. And here are my sources. You can just click on the link below if you want to see them, or click on the links, but here they are with the video. Well, thank you all. If you liked the video, please hit like.